Hello and welcome to this Infrastructure Victoria webinar on reducing greenhouse gas emissions of infrastructure. I'm Jonathan Spear, CEO of Infrastructure Victoria. I'm going to be your host today, and I'm very pleased that you're able to join us for this important conversation, which is very much related to the future of how we plan and operate and construct our infrastructure and how that relates to all that system around it in terms of how we fund it and to develop our industry as well. So it's an important conversation. Before we go any further, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting. I'm located on Infrastructure Victoria's office in Naarm, also known as Melbourne, and it's the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And so I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and any who might be joining us today. I'm really pleased to also be welcoming our panellists who are with us today. We've got Dr. Allison Stewart. Allison is Deputy CEO of Infrastructure Victoria. Welcome, Allison. And also with us is Jenkins. Jen is Director of Project Advisory and Evaluation at Infrastructure Australia. And we've got Friesz. Erica is Director of Strategy Planning and Innovation at Infrastructure New South Wales. It's great to have all three of you with us today. And later on, you'll be hearing from Jen and Erica about the work that is being done in the other jurisdictions around Australia and how that works with the recent advice the Infrastructure Victoria has been providing on reducing emissions of infrastructure. The other thing that you'll have a real opportunity to do is ask your own questions of the panel. And below the feed that you can see on your screen, you can see there's a Slido chat, and you can put your questions and answers in there, and you can also vote on other people's questions. So please get going with that. Get your thinking caps on about great questions you would like to ask this panel. They've got a lot of experience in this area about reducing emissions of infrastructure. So this is a great opportunity to ask your questions, and we will get to those then later on in this hour as we're talking through the webinar. So let's start about why has Infrastructure Victoria been doing this work? So many of you probably know that Infrastructure Victoria is the state's independent infrastructure advisor. And one of the functions we have is to provide advice to the government. And we had a specific request from it for advice on what are the opportunities to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions caused by future infrastructure investment, particularly at the front end of the process. So when governments are thinking about their investments, their business cases and their procurement processes. And we were asked to give advice on what are the options to reduce greenhouse gas emissions at that front end of when a state government like Victoria is commissioning public infrastructure, when it's planning it and commissioning it and operating it. There was also great interest on the part of government in whether there are opportunities to also reduce costs of infrastructure and improve the productivity of it, which might well be complementary to emissions reduction. And the third strand of the request for advice is that the government was particularly interested in the manner in which setting government policy about emissions reduction could also assist in collaboration with the private sector on which design and construction and operation methods are used all across the supply chain. So that was the framework on which we were asked to provide advice. How do we do it? We looked at, firstly, all the efforts that are being done across the world and in other jurisdictions, including Australia. So we looked across the border, particularly at what our colleagues in New South Wales have been doing, but also overseas in places like the UK and Europe, North America, where there's some good examples about how emissions reduction infrastructure is progressing. We also spent quite a bit of time interviewing Victorian government departments and agencies, but also major stakeholders, industry bodies and firms that are constructing infrastructure to get their perspectives on where we're at. And then we spent time with them looking at what the different policy options there are and hearing from them through submissions around the ways in which we might give advice to the Victorian government that is pragmatic and practical in reducing emissions of infrastructure. And for those of you who are joining us who made submissions or took part in those workshops and interviews, I'd like to very much thank you for your participation. We've really valued it. And it's fed into the recommendations that you're going to hear about more later. And Allison is going to take us through in more detail what those recommendations were. So why does decarbonising infrastructure matter? Some of this is obvious and some of this is less obvious. So the most obvious part, of course, is the effect that climate change has, and already we're experiencing that, and the objectives that state governments like Victoria and the Commonwealth government have to reduce emissions. Now, infrastructure is a considerable contributor to emissions reduction. Estimates are up to 70% of Australia's annual emissions are attributed to infrastructure, and that's through a combination of the actual embodied carbon that is in the construction of the infrastructure, the operating carbon, and the emissions that it sometimes enables as well, particularly in the case of some transport infrastructure. So new infrastructure projects do consume enormous amounts of energy and materials, particularly things like concrete and steel, which they have a lot of inputs to. There's some less obvious elements, though, about why decarbonising infrastructure matters. We know from talking to our industry colleagues that they are under a considerable pressure from their own investors, from international markets, and from regulations to decarbonise their operations. We also know that there are real opportunities for carbon emissions from infrastructure to also lead to cost savings and improve productivity. And I think we'll get to some of that when we do Q&A, when Allison takes you through some of our recommendations. And there's real opportunities for us to use recycled materials and digital engineering tools as we progress to both reduce carbon, but also seek to have cost savings and benefit the economy with its productivity. So overall, what that means is that there's a big opportunity for decarbonising infrastructure to both save money, but also improve productivity and create new jobs. Carbon is very much a proxy for the amount of materials and energy that we consume as we are building infrastructure. And so where we find opportunities to reduce carbon, that tends to be really good opportunities to use less material, to be less costly, and to use new options like digital engineering. Those are really important opportunities. The other big part of this is that if government sends clear signals that it values reduction in carbon and can flow that through its decision-making and procurement and contracting, that gives our industry clear signals about how it should develop, particularly development of low carbon materials and methodologies to construct and operate infrastructure. So that's where the influence of the Victorian government's policy settings on infrastructure decarbonisation can really help set up our economy for a low carbon future as decarbonisation becomes the new normal. So speaking of that, the new normal is certainly flowing through in other jurisdictions. We're seeing international standards and regulations and tariffs and capital markets are all aligning to drive carbon reduction. It's happening in a few ways. When we look at global standards, they are starting to drive thinking about how do we manage carbon across the life cycle of projects. And the standard that stands out in our research has been the UK's PAS 2080, which is about carbon management in buildings and infrastructure across their life cycle. There's also some other standards that exist too, and they're all heading in the same direction. We're seeing jurisdictions like the EU and the US starting to introduce carbon tariffs and policies, which if we don't change our policies may well disadvantage our industry development. And we're seeing new sustainability standards being driven through the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is driving public reporting on climate-related risks, including emissions impacts. And that's being flown through Commonwealth policy that's been flagged up for implementation over the next few years about reporting of climate-related risks by large companies. So those companies tell us they want clear policy and direction from governments like Victoria and New South Wales and the Commonwealth when we partner with them about the way in which we're planning to reduce our emissions, because they're under pressure to do the same from their investors and their regulators. So that's a real opportunity for us to align the policy that governments across Australia have with global movements to reduce carbon and be more transparent about where that is in our operations. It's now my great pleasure to hand over to Allison. Allison led a lot of this work with the Infrastructure Victoria team, and she'll describe to us, what our findings were, but also what our recommendations were to the Victorian government. So thank you, Allison. Over to you. Allison, you're on mute, so you might need to unmute yourself.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. Apologies for that. And thank you very much for everyone who is joining us this morning. So what we found when we really looked into this from a Victorian context was really overall, Victoria needs a new integrated approach to manage carbon emissions over the infrastructure life cycle. Currently, within Victoria, we do have some really great examples of where there are great carbon reduction practices, tools, or resources that are being deployed in individual agencies or individual projects, but these are not being done in a coordinated way. They're not being done consistently across different agencies. We know that carbon emissions reduction is considered one of many equal sustainability priorities. And the challenge with that is that actually it makes both carbon reduction less important in the context of what we're trying to do as a state to achieve net zero, but also tends to overshadow some of the other sustainability priorities, which equally are important for us to make sure that we consider. We know that our emissions reduction targets and policy statements have not yet been clearly translated into those project decisions in terms of understanding what the implication is if we don't actually start to adjust our infrastructure to really deliver on the potential for emissions reduction. We also know that the different resources that are being deployed can be really fantastic in individual examples. But again, if we're not sharing those with others, if we're not really giving our projects or agencies the best opportunities to learn from each other and to share those good practices, then actually we lose some of the benefit of that being able to be communicated throughout the Victorian government itself. And finally, non-build and low-carbon solutions, again, are being used in Victoria, but their prioritization varies across agencies, and it really does need to be led from the top in terms of the real impetus to try and explore some of these new opportunities, which are being wholeheartedly embraced in a lot of other jurisdictions, as you've heard from Jonathan. This often also occurs too late in the project lifecycle to really make a difference in project decision-making, and that's something that we'd really like to see change. We really think that having better leadership clarity and consistency can help to support emissions reduction in Victoria. We need to make sure that the carbon of infrastructure is actually considered, is valued, and it really is incorporated into the costs and benefits of projects when they are being assessed. And we'll come in a minute to what we're recommending from that perspective. We know that our current procurement guidelines don't have clear carbon reduction targets in them. And so while individual projects, as we've mentioned, sometimes are able to include that within their procurement frameworks, particularly where the people that are working in those projects have the expertise to be able to do so, a lot of other projects, a lot of other agencies, particularly smaller agencies, don't have the staff to be, or the experience to be able to really meaningfully incorporate that into their practice. We know that contracts are being awarded without taking carbon reduction opportunities into account, partly because procurement teams don't have the right information, knowledge, and experience to really evaluate tenderers' responses. So sometimes companies will proactively suggest ways that they can reduce carbon, and yet we are not giving ourselves within the Victorian government the opportunity to really take that up in practice. Many of our staff within the Victorian government departments, agencies that we spoke to in infrastructure say that they're not entirely clear about how they can reduce carbon emissions in their day-to-day work. And while they understand that the government has an ambition to reduce emissions, they don't have consistent or transparent ways to really quantify, value, and monitor and track those carbon emissions at a project level or at a portfolio level within the agencies. And there are really significant concerns about what the implications from a budget perspective would be of trying to actually decarbonize infrastructure. People are concerned about whether or not projects that are currently in flight will need to accommodate new carbon reduction requirements, and whether that might increase or put more pressure on a budget that has already been allocated to a project. They're also concerned about putting forward future projects in an environment in which the government is fiscally constrained, which have carbon reduction opportunities. So we really need to make sure that while we're going forward with decarbonisation and trying to achieve our net zero emissions target, that we help to give clear guidance to teams within the Victorian government about how to do this and how to address some of these concerns that they have. Jonathan spoke to this a little bit as well, but industry stakeholders have been really clear that they want governments to provide clear and consistent guidance so that they can actually help on their side to articulate what the opportunities are, that they can put forward in good faith within their procurement tenders, their suggestions for how we can actually achieve net zero emissions. So to really address some of these findings, we have put forward 3 overarching principles and 10 recommendations to government that we believe will help to get Victoria moving in the right direction of actually decarbonising our infrastructure. These overarching principles are really to be applied consistently across the way that we make our decisions about projects, and I'll take you through why that's the case. The first principle is to prioritize non-build or low-build solutions. And this is really a good principle anyway. We shouldn't be spending our money on big, new, shiny infrastructure projects when there's a better way to do the same or to make the same kind of a difference, either through demand management. So if we can help people to make decisions that will reduce the pressure on our infrastructure at peak times. For example, transport infrastructure, if we can give people incentives to travel at slightly different times of day through things like off-peak fares, that helps people to then be able to manage that peak demand. And we do need to build infrastructure for peak demand. If we can avoid doing so and we can actually make better decisions through those things like demand management or through better service approaches. So, for example, adding more service capacity, longer trains or more frequent trains, that's a better way than actually building a whole new train line. So thinking about non-build or low-build solutions first is really our first principle. Again, a good principle, but even more important as we're considering a decarbonised future. Secondly, this is not at all the area in which we should be going this alone. We do not want to be the leading jurisdiction in the world. We want to make sure that we are progressing in lockstep with our other colleagues across Australia, and that we're also taking the best of what's happening in other jurisdictions around the world. To be frank, we are a little bit behind the 8 ball at the moment in terms of incorporating some of this advice. Some of these things are being done routinely overseas now. We can really pick up the best of other jurisdictions' approaches and make sure that we're working really collaboratively with our colleagues in other jurisdictions in Australia so that we're giving really clear and consistent guidance to industry. That will give industry the best opportunity to really step up and help us to actually decarbonise. And that's part of the reason why we've invited our colleagues from Infrastructure Australia and Infrastructure New South Wales to participate with us today, is to really help to clarify how we are approaching that consistency. Our third principle is really to make sure that we clarify the scale and pace of infrastructure emissions reduction expectations to give confidence to the industry. Industry has told us that there are lots of things that they could be doing, lots of innovations that they would like to explore, but they're hesitant to commit to actually putting in place the initial funding that's required to be able to actually incorporate some of those things without knowledge of exactly what the timeline looks like for us to be able to incorporate some of these things in Victoria or more broadly throughout Australia. Similarly, having different timelines for different jurisdictions in terms of the pace that we're moving at is also quite complicated, because that means that they're putting forward different requirements, different materials, different opportunities, different procurement requirements in each different jurisdiction that they're operating in. And again, that doesn't provide industry with the best opportunity to support what we need to do going forward. Moving to our recommendations, our first recommendation on how we can decarbonise infrastructure in Victoria is really then about adopting a carbon management standard like PAS 2080. And this is really about giving, again, that confidence that we will have an end-to-end approach, a life cycle approach to managing carbon emissions. And again, giving others that clarity around how we are going to work within this. Now, it doesn't have to be PAS 2080. That is a UK standard. And we know that there's some work happening in Australia to consider whether or not there could be an equivalent Australian standard, but really something along this approach, which is considered, generally speaking, a world-leading approach to actually managing life cycle carbon, is what we need to have here to to really support that approach to actually decarbonizing all of our infrastructure. Next, we are recommending implementing the same carbon measurement approach as New South Wales and delivering training across the Victorian government on that approach. There are lots of tools to measure carbon that are out there right now, and actually there's no one tool that we would say is generally speaking leading across other tools. What's important though is making sure that no matter what tool you're using, that the estimate that you come out with is consistent, and that is using the same emissions reduction factors, the same understanding and implications about how we're actually going to evaluate that emissions impact going forward. And those kinds of things have to be done consistently regardless of tool. So making sure that those tools are applied consistently, and again, consistently across jurisdictions, in alignment with that principle I spoke about a couple of slides ago, is really critical to, again, industry being able to adopt the carbon measurement approaches that we're proposing. Delivering training is really just about making sure that people really understand how to use those tools, how to use those measurement approaches when they're available. The next recommendation that we've made is that the government should initially adopt a carbon value of at least $123 per tonne, and then update that value to reflect what is required to achieve our Victorian emissions reduction targets. The target consistent approach to developing a carbon value is very consistently used in other jurisdictions. This is really about what is the value of carbon that we need to put on it to help us to achieve our net zero targets. We have different targets in other jurisdictions, and it's important that we have clarity here in the value that we use to be able to actually do this. Now, carbon valuation isn't a carbon price. What it is basically a placeholder that allows you to make decisions that account for carbon. At the moment, that is not the case. We have consistent evidence through the findings that I spoke to earlier that actually people are not incorporating carbon into that decision making. Putting a value on it allows it to be actually considered within the context of that business case, and that's what we've recommended here. That $123 as an interim value really gets us started down that path. That's the value that New South Wales put into place towards the end of last year when they took a similar approach to measuring carbon with the expectation that it would be updated once they had calculated their emissions reduction target value. So again, that's the same approach that we're recommending here. You can see there what that $123 a tonne is based on. I'm happy to take questions about that in the question and answer, as I'm sure people will have it. But just to clarify, this isn't about the money that's required for this, or the value that we are putting on carbon doesn't actually translate into a financial cost for our project. It is a placeholder value that's used in the cost benefit analysis. Which takes us to our next recommendation, which is really then about actually integrating and updating our business case guidelines and templates to help integrate carbon emissions reduction. So we want to make sure that our assessment processes, our evaluation processes are really, really clear, and that all projects are being evaluated on the same basis. We want to make sure that those guidelines also then define how to set an emissions baseline, how to measure the carbon itself, and how to identify carbon reduction strategies. Again, just giving our project teams the tools to be able to make good decisions about how to reduce carbon. Then, as I mentioned in the last slide, measuring carbon and infrastructure cost-benefit analysis and making decisions that reduce emissions is the other element of this. So really making sure that actually when we value carbon, that is translating into the evaluation of our carbon abatement opportunities and making good decisions about how we do the project, what kinds of materials we use in the project, how we're actually going to measure the project over the life cycle, so through into operations as well, is really the key focus for how we decarbonize our infrastructure. So making sure that at that early decision-making stage that we are incorporating carbon into that cost-benefit analysis will help to put us on the right footing to then reduce carbon throughout the entire life cycle of the project itself. Our next recommendations are then about procurement. So we've recommended updating our procurement frameworks and guidance to embed carbon reduction in our tenders. We've pointed specifically to the guidance that we are recommending to include these in, including minimum decarbonization requirements, communicating the carbon reduction expectations, and alternative carbon reduction offers in tender documents. And again, this is going to help some of those organizations in the Victorian government who haven't yet been able to progress within a procurement framework to actually providing carbon reduction opportunities. It'll help our procurement teams to understand how they should evaluate those elements of tenders that are coming back to them. And it will help industry to really understand what it is that they're going to be evaluated against. So this really helps to drive through that carbon reduction opportunity from the business case into the practical realities of actually tendering for major contracts. We then recommended updating our standard form contracts as well to include carbon reporting, abatement requirements, and further reduction opportunities into the standard form contracts. Not every project uses those, but the projects that are reliant on using our standard form contracts really need the clarity about how we can work this into contracts. There's been some great examples overseas as well as within Australia about how we can actually do this and what exact wording we can put into our contracts to make this possible. Again, this is not about inventing new methods for contracting. This is about really making sure that we're delivering on the best opportunities that we can. And we've included some examples of what that kind of wording could look like. Then over time, we've recommended that we consider pre-qualification requirements for government contracts. Again, this is something that has been implemented in the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, it's there's a threshold above which this applies, but really this is about ensuring that industry is actually driving those carbon reduction requirements into their own businesses, and really establishing clear pre-qualification requirements for big contracts will help us to make sure that contractors have the necessary experience, knowledge, and commitment to decarbonisation and the net zero target. Again, this is not dissimilar to the way that as an industry, safety has been incorporated in other companies, for example, but really thinking about how we actually think about pre-qualifying our tenderers is important. Again, we already do pre-qualification. This would really be about incorporating carbon into that process. The last one on procurement is about then supporting decarbonisation innovations across industry by two particular mechanisms. First, testing alternative materials. So we know that some projects do test alternative materials to incorporate, for example, recycled materials to incorporate into their projects themselves. However, some of those materials testing requirements have long lead times. And so it only really applies to big projects who have the impetus to start really early on in those projects to test those additional materials. We need to make sure that the information about that process is communicated really widely, and ideally that government takes a bit more of a leadership role across all different types of infrastructure to be able to ensure that the clarity of which materials are suitable for which purposes is provided to the entire industry. The second element that we're recommending in this particular recommendation is adopting performance-based standards. There's lots of good reasons why we should move towards performance-based standards. So rather than specifying really particularly within our requirements that we have a particular product that we want you to use, if we move to performance basis, we can say we need a product that performs to this level of performance. And that actually gives industry much more of an ability to innovate when they are recommending what kinds of materials we should be using on our projects. So that certainly would help from industry's perspective, again, in terms of their leadership in this space and really helping us to decarbonize. Our final recommendation is really then to integrate all of these good ideas into our assurance processes. Again, this is rounding out the cycle and making sure that as we are progressing through our projects, that we're not just setting ourselves at the beginning and then as things get busy, letting things fall by the wayside. So we need to make sure that our project assurance checks also incorporate the changes that we have proposed within recommendations 1 to 9. And we'd like to see carbon emissions reported in our benefit management plans as well. Again, this is not the only place that we can manage carbon, but it's a really important part of the cycle to ensure that we're actually driving consistent reductions of carbon throughout our projects. In terms of the timeline then that we have proposed, we really think, and we provided this advice to the Victorian government at the end of 2023 in September, we really think that kind of setting up the policy and strategy is the first piece before you move into an implementation phase, which really is about building on the policy direction, providing clear, implementable and actionable short-term changes, providing interim guidance where possible. Again, very similar to the approach that New South Wales has taken. Starting to pilot testing implementation with industry is a really good approach. Moving then into an implementation phase 2, which we recommended is really about rolling out any pilots that you've applied more widely, really ensuring that your financial guidance is really clear, making sure that all of the pieces have then been completed and put together before moving into the kind of final phase of policy and strategy development, is really to progressively expand your requirements and to extend and update your guidance and training to others within the government. We do think that it's really necessary that we do this in a relatively short period of time. We're conscious that moving to, as Jonathan said earlier, this decarbonised infrastructure future is going to be the new business as usual and is already in most parts of the world the new business as usual. We need to move more quickly in Victoria to make sure that we're really embracing those opportunities and we're not getting left behind on these things. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy now to turn back to Jonathan, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about the work that we've done.
Great. Thank you very much, Allison. And we're also going to turn to have our guests, Erica and Jen as well, join us shortly, because we're really interested in hearing their perspectives from what's happening across the border and nationally as well. There's some great questions that you've been popping in the chat and in the Slido function. So please keep on those questions coming through. We're going to get to those shortly. Well, we might turn to Erica, to you first. Erica has been leading a lot of Infrastructure New South Wales's work in implementing their decarbonisation strategy. Erica, tell us a bit more about what's in Infrastructure New South Wales strategy and where are you up to with implementing it?
Sure. Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. Congratulations also on Victoria's advice. It's so great to see alignment across jurisdictions, and that's just going to be incredibly useful for industry. So where we're up to, we are preparing to launch our decarbonising infrastructure delivery policy and the measurement guidance on the 4th of April. So that's incredibly exciting. And we're also launching an update to the joint roadmap that we prepared with Transport for New South Wales. So that will signal to industry, that decarbonisation is a priority to government and give them some certainty on what's coming up in the future and where the priorities are. So similar to Infrastructure Victoria, we did extensive consultation across government and industry and found that industry really wanted two key things, and that was a clear policy mandate to know what government wants from them and a consistent approach to measurement to really give them the confidence to act in this space. So that's what we prioritized, and that's what we're launching on the 4th of April, the policy and the measurement approach. There will be a 12-month transition period before the policy becomes operational in early 2025. And over that time, we're going to work incredibly collaboratively with both government and industry to really co-design this implementation program with a really big focus on understanding and uplifting capability in the space. We consider that to be incredibly important so that people are confident in their abilities to act and that the results that we get on the back end of the policy are meaningful and can help drive real change. We also have the measurement guidance, which I mentioned, and this really provides that consistent approach to measuring across all the different asset types. Our policy has similar requirements to what Infrastructure Victoria has proposed in their advice, and key to that is measuring consistently and reporting at 3 stages of the project lifecycle, focusing, of course, on the early project stages where there's the opportunity to really influence decision making and reduce carbon. So we require measurement at the business case stage, noting that that'll be a little bit rubbery there. Also at planning approval and procurement. And we require tenderers in procurement documentation, to require tenderers to submit as-built data at practical completion. And then obviously we require the measurement reporting at practical completion. I'm also really excited to share an update on our national measurement guidance. So in June last year, the Infrastructure and Transport Ministers endorsed adapting the New South Wales guidance for national use. So the team's been working really hard, consulting across jurisdictions, and we have a couple more steps to get before that piece of work is finalized, but we're really excited to have this national consistency. On that note, I just want to reiterate again how great it is to see this alignment and really what it means for industry. So thank you, and yeah, look forward to continuing to collaborate.
Thanks, Erica. It's really great to have that update on how things are going in New South Wales. And of course, there's been really strong collaboration across governments, as you were saying, at the National Infrastructure and Transport Ministers level. And I certainly know that amongst all the infrastructure advisory bodies like Infrastructure Victoria and New South Wales, Infrastructure Australia, but also our colleagues in New Zealand and New South Wales and South Australia and Western Australia. There's also this very strong impetus to drive some consistency of approach in reducing infrastructure emissions. So that's really heartening to see. And thank you to our colleagues in New South Wales for taking some of these first steps. Jen, I'll turn to you next, because you've been leading Infrastructure Australia's work on greenhouse gas emission reductions, and there's been some recent work that's been released. Tell us a bit about what's happening at the national level and that IEA is leading.
Thanks, Jonathan. And hello, everyone. Congratulations to Infrastructure Victoria as well on that fantastic piece of work. And we also look forward to seeing the New South Wales work when that's released in April. And agree, it's great to be able to celebrate some national harmonisation in this area. In terms of our work at Infrastructure Australia, we have a very strong focus on decarbonising infrastructure as well, which is, of course, consistent with the Australian government's objectives. When the Climate Change Act was National Climate Change Act was introduced in 2022, our governing legislation was also updated to require us to consider greenhouse gas emissions across all our work streams. And one of our major work streams is the evaluation of business cases. So our role at Infrastructure Australia is to evaluate business cases for infrastructure proposals from jurisdictions seeking more than $250 million in Commonwealth government funding. So we have, as a result of that legislative change, introduced requirements for emissions to be measured and costed in cost-benefit analysis that forms part of the business cases that are submitted to us for evaluation. To make that easier and more consistent across jurisdictions, we yesterday released some national emissions values that are based on modelling of the least cost approach to achieve Australia's legislated emissions targets. That's the same target consistent approach that is used in many jurisdictions, and strictly for the purpose of use in economic analysis. It really is that placeholder. It's an economic value rather than a financial cost, and really something that we hope to see incentivising the use of low carbon materials, recycled materials, and those design choices to try and avoid and minimise emissions throughout the project life cycle. So, obviously a very long process from conception to delivery, operation and evaluation of an infrastructure proposal. But, given a lot of the factors that have been outlined today and the global drivers as well, it's important to have that piece of cost-benefit analysis lining up with the broader work that governments are progressing. So, so we see, this is sort of one part in the process, and that will ensure that, where projects are trying to prioritise decarbonising use of low carbon materials, that will be adequately represented in cost-benefit analysis. So that's been released up on our website yesterday, and that's available for proponents and others to have a look at and see how we've recommended applying those values in infrastructure cost-benefit analysis.
Great, thank you, Jan, and congratulations on that work being released. That's really helpful, I think, for everybody to have that out and know what the national position is on both how IEA is going to approach assessment of emissions and also those carbon values. Something that's probably worth digging into is that if for those of you who've had a chance to look at those carbon values, they're at least initially a little bit different to the numbers that we have in our advice and that New South Wales have been using. They're a little bit lower to start with, and then they go a bit higher. Why is that, Jen? Talk us through, how those emission values are calculated and how they might change over time, and why do they change over time?
Yeah, that's a great question. The values have been developed based on bespoke modelling of the Australian economy, of Australia's opportunities to reduce emissions and the expected cost of abatement over time. As the name suggests, they're also closely linked to our current national target, including our interim targets. So if you look at the values, you can see that they're low to start with. There's quite a bit more certainty around the values in the early stages, and then as there's more uncertainty, and there'll be release of new interim targets by the Commonwealth Government. The next one is expected next year. There will be updates to the values to reflect changes in the target. And there'll also be reviews over time. We expect that as innovation occurs and we become more efficient at producing infrastructure that minimises emissions, that the costs of carbon will reduce over time. So there's quite a few factors involved there. But really one of the main things that's driving the values is the abundant opportunities that we have in Australia to minimise our emissions at low cost through solar, through wind, through not clearing vegetation, but that is expected to increase over time as harder to abate sectors like aviation start to address their opportunities to reduce emissions.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, it's really important to understand how these emissions values for infrastructure factor into the longer run thinking and the broader economy effects. And of course, the big opportunity there is to be reducing emissions for infrastructure and thinking about that now because it's so long-lived. We've got a really good question from Jeff Robertson that's come through, and I'll read it out. Jeff says, in a carbon-constrained world where we are limited in the amount of upfront carbon we can expand on our buildings and infrastructure, do we need to have price signals such as the price on carbon to encourage greater innovation in designing, constructing and operating our buildings and infrastructure? So great question, Jeff. I think the answer is yes. And one thing you'll see consistently, of course, is through the work that many of us have been doing as we see there being value in putting a value on carbon. Allison, I might turn to you to draw some of this out a bit further. So when we put a value of carbon and then put it into a business case, what does that actually mean? What does it mean for what and how we build? And does it mean that projects that before might have had a positive BCR, cost benefit number, now won't? How is this going to drive decision making in real and operation in real life?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan, and thanks for the question, Jeff. I would say that, so while what we're recommending is a carbon value rather than a carbon price, the decision about a carbon price is really one for the national government, as we're all very much aware of, and different jurisdictions around the world are making different decisions about carbon pricing. Regardless of what happens at that level, using a carbon value within our project business cases helps us to really, as I said before, ensure that we're making decisions that are consistent. Now, there are lots of these big projects that have actually been estimating their emissions within their environmental effects statement processes. And so we went back and had a bit of a look at things like the North East Link project and the Suburban Railway project. And both of those projects have estimated emissions of around 2 million tonnes over the life cycle of their projects. And they propose within the environmental effect statements other ways that they can try and reduce that. Now, at the value that we had put into our advice, that initial value of $120 a tonne, that translates into a value of $250 million for each of those projects that would have been incorporated into that business case analysis. That's not going to change your decision about those projects. Those projects are multi-billion-dollar projects, and that value isn't going to mean that you make a different decision about whether to proceed. It will make a different decision, however, about how you actually manage your carbon, and that's what we're looking for here. Is not necessarily to completely overhaul everything that we're doing, and certainly the Victorian government has the ability to decide on which projects are necessary to manage all of our growing demand and pressures from a population perspective, etc. However, it's important that we do that responsibly and that we make those good decisions. So while we're incorporating that value, for example, into our projects, it's likely that that will make different materials more attractive, that will make the opportunity to really consider different methods of construction, like modular construction, more relevant, that will give us further impetus to work with industry to come up with better ways to actually deliver on these projects with a real focus on how we reduce carbon. As well, when we said earlier, what Jonathan mentioned about carbon being a proxy for materials, what we think is that actually this is a really good decision to be made for our projects going forward, because once you've really put that laser focus on carbon, you do quite quickly end up at actually what are the best ways for us to reduce carbon intensive materials. And some of that is using tools like digital engineering models that help us to see where we might be putting too much or too great of an emphasis on some of our materials like concrete, and where we might be able to reduce the overall quantity of those materials while still ensuring the structural integrity of the infrastructure that we're building. If we can reduce those materials, then actually we are also reducing cost at the same time. And so we expect that overall, when we're looking at carbon and getting that much more integrated focus on carbon into our projects, that leads to us doing other things really well. And of course, value engineering is something that we should all be doing on our projects anyway, and really trying to get the materials quantities down. This gives another fantastic reason and a great impetus to do so. And that's certainly what we've seen in other jurisdictions overseas, that focus is helping them to make the same kinds of decisions.
Great, thanks, Allison. Yeah, really good to clarify that. We'll move off carbon values for now. I've got a question for you, Erica, which really kind of connects to the great work that Infrastructure New South Wales have been doing, thinking about, for example, what standards and tools and so forth we're using. We've got a question that Helena has raised, which touches on this, and she asks for a bit more information about what's being done to implement an Australian version of PAS 2080. So you might want to touch on that, but perhaps more broadly, tell us a bit more about the work that's being done to give guidance on standards and both carbon management standards, but also standards to how we build and construct our infrastructure.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan, and thanks for the question. I guess I'll start with the PAS 2080. So in New South Wales, we've taken what we like to call a PAS 2080 light approach. And that really just recognizes the difference in maturity in the sector and allows us to take interim steps, things like ensuring that people can measure, that they are considering those, build less, build more efficiently options, things like that. But it is very closely aligned with PAS 2080. In terms of the national guidance, again, that is something to bring about consistency in the way that we measure emissions. It's not actually a policy in and of itself, so it does allow other jurisdictions to adopt it. Sorry, my light just turned off, to adopt it and use it in the context of their own policy settings, which may include PAS 2080 or may include some other international standards or whatever's best for them in that particular jurisdiction. In terms of tools, like it was mentioned earlier, there are a ton of tools in the market, each of which have their own sort of pros and cons. Our policy does not specifically prescribe any particular tool. We're just focused on getting those tools aligned so that what we put into them and what we get out of them are consistent across the different asset types and across the sector more broadly.
Yeah, thanks, Erica. And what that really tells us, I think, is about the importance of taking this step by step, a little bit like Allison was describing about the implementation of our advice, that we don't need to go from 0 to 100% new standards and ways of doing things. We need to all go on a journey, but the journey starts now. And of course, one of the other elements of this is the degree we collaborate with industry and our research institutions too. And so, Jen, I've got a question for you coming up about the way in which some of the work we're all doing connects to research institutions. And Amanda Huang has asked about any initiatives of our government collaborating with research institutions to promote this integrated approach to infrastructure lifecycle management. And it might be that other members of the panel would like to comment on this too, but what are you seeing and thinking in terms of the way government can collaborate with research institutions as we all seek to progress the decarbonisation agenda?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, and I see it as being absolutely essential. In the work on valuing emissions, we drew on expertise from Monash University and ANU. I think while, Australia has some catching up to do, there is a lot of examples from other jurisdictions, and, we really need to, access all the expertise in that journey forward. We see it as very much as well being a culture shift, that decarbonising is part of BAU, and capacity uplift shift that's required, and working with the broadest possible range of stakeholders will be essential to that, and learning from what's worked best in other jurisdictions too.
Yeah, absolutely, and of which our research partners can certainly help. And Erica, I wonder whether you are also experiencing opportunities to learn both from our research institutions, but also in industry partnerships. And one of the questions that's come through is about how can we be learning from our failures? Because, of course, when things don't go well, that's often a chance to actually learn and do things better. And we are starting to do things differently here. So how are we implementing that in New South Wales in learning and sharing our lessons as we start to this decarbonisation implementation?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jonathan. It is a very important topic, and it does seem to be the trend that everyone likes to share the good news stories and less so about kind of those lessons learned. Through our policy, we do have an optional action at practical completion to report back on lessons learned. And we really do encourage and have seen a lot of traction just within government agencies to date on just sharing those lessons and really working collaboratively to build capacity and capability within the sector. We're also working incredibly closely with industry peak bodies to reach their members and to get the message out, across the board. And we're working closely with the likes of training providers and some of our close industry peak body members to design a training program to understand what's available in the market, and in some cases to actually work to co-design, a bespoke training program that responds directly to these upfront embodied emissions that our policy is focused on. So I think that the more we bring this into BAU, the more we upskill not just particular sectors or an overarching green sort of sustainability person, but to really upskill and incrementally change across the entire project lifecycle in both government and industry, get people talking about this more and more. It'll become more commonplace, and I think those ideas and those lessons to be shared will flow more freely.
Yeah, absolutely agree, Erica. And certainly in our advice, we pointed to the opportunities for communities of practice, both within government, across government departments, but also between government and industry to similarly be sharing those experiences. Allison, I'll go to you for the next question. We've got a great and a constructively challenging question that's come through from Christian. And Christian asks, why is it that putting the spotlight on carbon should lead to both emissions and cost reductions? If we're currently constructing our infrastructure with excess materials, why isn't the opportunity of cost reduction in and of itself enough for us to seek these optimisations?
Great question, Christian. Thank you for that. And certainly that should be happening anyway, right? We should be looking at this. And this is another way of looking at this is that this isn't yet another reason why we should be trying to do this. We should be reducing our materials anyway. We should be using the most appropriate recycled materials that we can if they're at a cost-effective price. Part of the challenge is going to be in terms of actually achieving our net zero targets. A lot of people have this conception that it's going to be much more expensive to purchase other types of materials. And part of the challenge is that at the moment, a lot of those materials that are green concrete, for example, or recycled materials do come at a slight premium compared to the kind of non-green alternatives. The challenge is that at the moment, without that clarity for industry to really invest in these kinds of materials, without a clear timeline to actually incorporate those net zero emissions targets into the way that we are progressing, that is not going to change because we're going to continue to have those more expensive materials. And yet we do need to start using them because over time we know that we need to achieve our net zero emissions target. So right now we are almost caught in this kind of middle ground before we've really moved into that future, which is creating an unhelpful kind of dynamic. So we believe that as we provide that clarity and consistency between jurisdictions and really give industry that clear signal that this is where we want to go to, the prices of those products are very much likely to come down. And we have seen that again happening overseas. Incorporating with that this additional cost reduction pressure, often when we are in our projects and we're looking at opportunities like value engineering, we all know that we consider those opportunities. Some of them do go in, but usually the pace that we're moving at within infrastructure projects does mean that sometimes we can't incorporate all the good ideas that we have that would reduce our materials and potentially reduce our costs at the time in which it would make the greatest difference. The early parts of our projects are the best opportunity to do that. We all know that kind of value curve and that actually that is the best time that we can be doing these things. But again, if we're not thinking about carbon at that stage, we're not looking at the opportunities that carbon can provide to really give us a different lens on some of these things. With the way that we're approaching at the moment, again, with our standards and the standards that we are using can be quite prescriptive in terms of what we expect contractors to use. We're creating an environment in which we are really tying industry's hands and being able to actually propose some of those innovations that might help us to reduce costs and materials now at the front end, regardless of carbon. Again, this is another impetus and another reason that we think we could unlock the opportunity. And again, why we've included performance-based standards as one of our recommendations, because these things all work together. But really, it's not that carbon is kind of on the other side of the cost equation, is the point that we really want to make sure is clear, that actually carbon and cost reduction can work together in the environment in which we should all be thinking about more cost reduction opportunities. And really there's a virtuous cycle between actually thinking about better carbon and better cost and actually getting better overall outcomes for our projects.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more, Allison. And then we have another really interesting question, which I might put to you, Jen. It's also constructively challenging. And the question is this more of a transitional issue? That is, once we fully transition our grid to renewable sources, we don't need to worry about embodied carbon. This should also accelerate our transition to renewables from fossil fuels. So to what extent is emissions reduction in infrastructure just going to look after itself? And why do we need to have such a focus on this?
Yeah, that's a great question too. Based on what we're seeing in other jurisdictions, especially transport infrastructure is stubbornly constant, even where great progress has been made in decarbonising the grid. Transport remains fairly constant and bouncing back after COVID. So, and it's estimated that by 2030, transport, including transport infrastructure, will be our largest source of emissions. So I think, yes, very much a strong need to continue focusing on infrastructure if we are to achieve the targets that have been set by the Commonwealth Government and and the interim targets along the way.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. That's certainly consistent with our findings and analysis about where there are stubbornly challenging emission sources for us to focus on. And if we don't get going now on reducing emissions of the infrastructure, particularly embodied emissions, it's going to get challenging in future decades for us to really hit those targets. Now we've just got a couple of minutes left. You can find next to in the Slido panel, we have a short poll that you can find, and we would love to hear from you about both what you think about this webinar. It's just a short number of questions, and any feedback and suggestions you have. We're always looking to hear your views about how we can improve, but also what future issues you might like to see covered in Infrastructure Victoria's webinars. So please take the opportunity to do that. In rounding out, one of the questions that's come forward has been around political leadership. And of course, one of the reasons that Erica and Jen are here is because there's been political leadership shown in New South Wales in particular quite early about the need for change and decarbonisation of infrastructure. And so that's a really important point throughout this, that what our advice and the work of Infrastructure Australia and Infrastructure New South Wales have done is provide many of the practical pathways and tools about how we make decisions. But it is going to need political leadership, and it's going to need collaboration as well between government, industry and research institutions. And I think that's what collectively this work points to is a real opportunity to do that. So I'd encourage you to jump on the Infrastructure Victoria website and have a look at our advice, and you can dive into all the detail that we've covered today. But you can also see online the work that other jurisdictions like New South Wales and a national level Infrastructure Australia have been doing. This really is about making decarbonisation of infrastructure the new business as usual, and we think that it's got multiple benefits in industry development, in reducing costs, improving productivity, and of course in reducing emissions. So we look forward to continuing to work with you and others across Australia as we progress infrastructure decarbonisation. Thank you very much for joining this webinar today. I'd particularly like to thank Erica and Jen. You are officially friends of the show, and you're welcome back anytime. Thank you, Allison, as always, for your contribution. We look forward to seeing many of you at a future Infrastructure Victoria webinar or other event. Thank you very much and have a great day.